What would you do if you discovered you had 6 months to live, and the person who stayed by your side didn't know you were a billionaire? Nathaniel Cross didn't believe in mercy. He believed in control. And on the afternoon, a doctor handed him a folder marked terminal. He learned that control was just another lie the powerful tell themselves. Stay until the end. And if you believe love reveals itself in the darkest hours, like this video and subscribe. The rain hammered against the glass walls of Cross Tower, 60 floors above the city. Nathaniel stood motionless, staring at the blood test results, as if they were written in a language he'd forgotten how to read. 6 months. His assistant, Marcus, stood frozen by the door. "Sir, I don't know what to..." "Leave." The word was ice. Marcus hesitated. "Your family should know. They'll know when I'm dead." The door clicked shut. Nathaniel was alone, 34 years old, heir to a $15 billion empire, and suddenly mortal. He didn't cry. Men like him didn't cry. They strategized. But when he looked down at his hands, the same hands that signed billion-dollar contracts, that built empires, that commanded rooms, they were shaking. That night he made a decision. He would disappear. No press, no family, no board meetings or charity galas where people smiled with venom behind their teeth. He would spend his final months as someone else. Someone ordinary. He told only Marcus. "Find me a place quiet, remote, somewhere no one knows my name." "Sir, this is insane. Do it." 3 days later, Nathaniel Cross ceased to exist. In his place, Nate Rivers, a quiet man recovering from a minor health scare, renting a cottage on the edge of a coastal town so small it didn't appear on most maps. He brought nothing, no security, no luxury, just silence. And the gnawing, suffocating realization that he had no idea who he was without his name. The hospice nurse arrived on a Tuesday. She knocked 3 times, soft but firm, and when he opened the door, she smiled, not the practiced smile of someone paid to care, but something real. "Mr. Rivers." "Just Nate. I'm Elena." She was younger than he expected, late 20s maybe. Dark eyes that seemed to notice everything, hair pulled back in a braid, scrubs that had seen too many shifts. No makeup. No pretense. She didn't recognize him, and for the first time in years, Nathaniel exhaled. "I'm not dying yet," he said, sharper than intended. Elena tilted her head. "Good. Then I'll just make sure you stay that way a little longer." She moved past him into the cottage, setting down a medical bag with the ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "I don't need a babysitter." "Lucky for you, I'm a nurse." She glanced back, eyes steady. "And I don't babysit. I keep people alive." He almost smiled. Almost. The first week he barely spoke. Eleanor came every morning at 9, checked his vitals, left notes on medications he wasn't actually taking, and disappeared by noon. She never asked why a man his age needed hospice care, never commented on the expensive watch he forgot to remove, never pried, and that confused him. Everyone wanted something from Nathaniel Cross: power, money, access, approval. But Eleanor just worked. One morning she found him on the porch staring at the ocean. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep." She set down her bag, leaned against the railing beside him, didn't offer hollow comfort, didn't fill the silence with noise, just stood there. After a long moment she spoke. "My brother died 2 years ago, cancer. He spent his last months angry at everyone, at God, at the doctors, at me." She paused. "But the night before he passed, he told me he wished he'd spent less time being angry and more time just being." Nathaniel's throat tightened. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Me too." She turned to leave, then stopped. "You're not dying, Nate, but you're living like you are." The door closed softly behind her, and for the first time since the diagnosis, fake or not, Nathaniel Cross felt something crack open inside his chest. That night, Marcus called. "Sir, the board is asking questions." "Your father, let them ask. They're threatening a vote of no confidence." Nathaniel stared at the ceiling. "Good." Silence. "Sir, if they can't survive 6 months without me, then I built nothing worth keeping." He hung up, and in the silence that followed, he realized something terrifying. He didn't want to go back. But the next morning, when Eleanor arrived, she wasn't smiling. She stood in the doorway, holding a newspaper. Her face was pale. "Nate." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Who are you?" The headline screamed across the front page, "Billionaire heir Nathaniel Cross missing, feared dead." And beneath it, his photo. The same face staring back at her now. The newspaper fell from her hands, fluttering to the floor between them like a confession neither could take back. Elena didn't move, didn't speak. Just stared at him with those dark eyes that had seen him at his weakest. The man who couldn't sleep, who flinched at kindness, who sat on the porch at dawn like he was waiting for permission to exist. Nathaniel felt the floor tilt beneath him. He'd spent weeks building this fragile, quiet thing, this version of himself that didn't have to perform, didn't have to conquer, and now it was disintegrating in real time, right there in her silence. She took one step back, then another. Her hand found the doorframe, steadying herself, and he watched her face cycle through shock, confusion, betrayal, all the emotions he'd seen 1,000 times in boardrooms, but never like this. Never from someone who'd touched his wrist to check his pulse, who'd reminded him to eat, who'd stood beside him in silence and made it feel like mercy. He wanted to explain, wanted to tell her about the diagnosis, the fear, the suffocating weight of a name that felt more like a prison than a legacy. But the words tangled in his throat, useless and heavy. She bent down, picked up the newspaper with trembling hands, and read the headline again, as if repetition might change it. When she looked up, her voice was barely audible. "You lied to me." Not a question, a fact, and the truth of it carved something out of him. She left without another word. The door didn't slam. It closed with a soft, final click that echoed louder than any argument. Nathaniel stood frozen in the center of the cottage, surrounded by the life he'd borrowed. The simple furniture, the unwashed coffee mug, the medical chart Elena had been keeping, notes written in her careful handwriting, vitals stable, appetite improving, emotional affect and guarded but responsive. He sank into the chair by the window. Outside, the ocean continued its indifferent rhythm, waves crashing, retreating, crashing again. For the first time since the diagnosis, Nathaniel Cross felt like he was actually dying. She didn't come back the next day, or the day after. The hospice agency sent a replacement, a middle-aged man named Gerald, who checked boxes on a clipboard and left within 20 minutes. Professional, efficient, utterly forgettable. Nathaniel barely noticed. He spent hours staring at his phone, Elena's number highlighted but never dialed. What could he possibly say? That he'd lied because he was afraid, that for once in his calculated, controlled life, he'd wanted to be seen as something other than a transaction, that she'd made him feel human. The words felt pathetic, even in his own head. On the 4th day, Marcus called again. The board had issued an ultimatum: return within 72 hours or face removal. His father, cold, methodical Victor Cross, had already begun positioning Nathaniel's younger brother as successor. "They're moving fast, sir. If you don't come back now, then let them move." Marcus's frustration bled through the line. "This is everything you've worked for, everything your grandfather built." "My grandfather died alone in a hospital room surrounded by lawyers." Nathaniel's voice was flat. "That's his legacy, not mine." He ended the call, but the truth gnawed at him. He wasn't staying because of some noble revelation. He was hiding, and hiding felt worse than dying. On the 5th day, he saw her. She was walking along the beach at dusk, hands buried in the pockets of her jacket, head down against the wind. He recognized the set of her shoulders, the way she carried weight without letting it break her. He didn't plan to follow, didn't plan to call out. But his feet moved anyway. "Eleanor." She stopped but didn't turn around. The surf filled the silence between them, cold and relentless. When she finally faced him, her expression was unreadable. Tired, guarded, but not cruel. "I don't know what you want me to say," she said quietly. "Nothing. I just..." He faltered. "I needed you to know it wasn't about you." Her laugh was bitter, almost sad. "Of course it wasn't. It was about you. It's always about people like you." The words hit like a fist. "I was scared," he said, and the admission felt like stepping off a cliff. The diagnosis. "I thought I was dying. And I realized I'd spent my entire life being Nathaniel Cross, and I had no idea who that even was." His voice cracked. "You were the first person who looked at me and didn't see a name, just me." Eleanor's eyes glistened, but she didn't let the tears fall. "So you lied?" "Yes." "And now?" He shook his head. "Now I don't know. The diagnosis might be wrong, or it might not. But I know I can't go back to who I was before." She studied him for a long moment, and he felt stripped bare under her gaze, exposed in a way no boardroom, no media interrogation, no family confrontation had ever managed. Finally, she spoke. "My brother spent his last months pushing everyone away because he didn't want to be a burden. And I spent those months wishing he'd just let me stay." Her voice broke. "You don't get to decide for other people what they can handle, Nate. Or Nathaniel. Or whoever you are." She turned and walked away, her silhouette disappearing into the fading light. And Nathaniel stood there, salt wind stinging his face, realizing that losing her hurt more than the thought of losing his empire ever had. That night, an envelope arrived. No return address, just his name, his real name, written in careful script. Inside, a single sentence. "The test results were falsified. Thought you should know. M." Nathaniel read it 3 times. Not dying, never dying. The relief should have been overwhelming. Instead, it felt like the ground had vanished beneath him entirely, because now he had no excuse, no reason to hide, no terminal countdown to justify becoming someone else, just a choice, and the terrifying freedom that came with it. The letter sat on the table for 3 days, untouched after that first reading, as if ignoring it might unmake the truth. Not dying. The words should have felt like liberation. Instead, they felt like an accusation. Nathaniel had built his entire escape on the foundation of mortality, a deadline that justified running, that made cowardice look like clarity. But now that foundation had crumbled, and he was left standing in the ruins of a lie he'd told himself as much as anyone else. He wasn't dying. He was just afraid to live. The realization hit him at 4 in the morning, staring at the cottage ceiling while rain drummed against the roof. He'd convinced himself he was discovering who he was beneath the empire, beneath the name. But the truth was simpler and more devastating. He'd been hiding from the question entirely. Marcus arrived the next afternoon without warning, suit wrinkled from travel, exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes. He stood in the doorway, rain-soaked and furious. The silence between them was a conversation unto itself. Marcus had served the Cross family for 12 years, had watched Nathaniel transform from an idealistic heir into something harder, sharper, untouchable, had executed every cold strategy, every ruthless decision without question, until now. Marcus set a folder on the table. Inside, documents, board resolutions, signatures, a corporate execution already in motion. Nathaniel's removal was complete. His brother would be announced as CEO within the week. The empire his grandfather had built, that his father had fortified, that Nathaniel himself had expanded into something unprecedented. It was moving on without him. And the strangest part was the absence of rage. He felt nothing. No, that wasn't true. He felt relief. Marcus spoke finally, voice rough with something between disappointment and understanding. He'd known about the falsified diagnosis from the beginning, had orchestrated parts of this disappearance himself. But watching Nathaniel choose exile over empire had shifted something fundamental between them. The assistant who'd executed orders without question was looking at him now, like he didn't recognize the man he'd served. Marcus left the same way he'd arrived, without ceremony, without resolution. Just a quiet departure that felt like the severing of an old life. Nathaniel burned the documents that night in the fireplace, watching his corporate identity curl into ash. The flames reflected in the window glass, and beyond them the dark ocean rolled endlessly forward. Indifferent, eternal, unmoved by human empires or human fears. He thought about his grandfather, stern Victor Cross Sr., who'd built everything from nothing and died clutching acquisition papers. About his father, who'd spent 40 years fortifying walls instead of building bridges. About his brother, who'd waited patiently in the shadows for this exact moment. The Cross legacy was one of accumulation, of conquest, of transforming everything into property, including people. And Nathaniel had inherited that hunger without question, had wielded it like destiny, until a false diagnosis forced him to ask the question he'd spent his life avoiding: what was any of it worth? He found Elena 3 days later at the community health clinic where she worked her other job. The building was small, paint-chipped, filled with the kind of people who didn't appear in his former world. Working mothers with tired eyes, elderly men with proud shoulders and empty pockets, children who'd learned too early that life was negotiation. Eleanor moved through them like water, efficient but warm, remembering names, asking about grandchildren, adjusting the bill for a patient who couldn't afford the copay. Nathaniel watched from the doorway, invisible in his ordinary clothes, and understood with brutal clarity why she'd looked at him with such contempt. This was her world. Real, necessary, human. And he'd played pretend in it like it was a costume he could remove. She saw him eventually, and her expression flickered, surprise, then something harder to name. Not anger anymore, something closer to resignation. She finished with her patient, made a note in a worn file folder, then walked toward him with the deliberate calm of someone who'd made a decision. They stood outside in the parking lot, evening settling around them like ash. Elena spoke first, and her voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent days wrestling with truth. She'd looked him up after the newspaper, read the articles, seen the photos of galas and acquisitions, the interviews where he spoke about market disruption with the passion most people reserved for family. She'd seen who Nathaniel Cross was, brilliant, ruthless, untouchable, and she'd tried to reconcile that with the man who couldn't sleep, who watched the ocean like it held answers, who'd flinched when she'd shown him simple kindness. Her conclusion was simple. She didn't know which version was real, maybe both, maybe neither. But what she did know was that she'd spent 2 years watching her brother die while pushing everyone away, convinced his suffering was his alone to carry. And she'd sworn after burying him that she'd never let someone else make that choice for her. So she'd come to a decision. If Nathaniel wanted to keep running, keep hiding behind false names and borrowed lives, she wouldn't stop him. But she wouldn't participate either. Wouldn't be the excuse he used to avoid facing whatever he was running from. But if he wanted to stop running, actually stop, not just pause, then she'd consider listening. Her terms were non-negotiable. Truth, complete and uncomfortable. No performance, no strategy, just the terrifying, undignified work of being honest about who he was and what he was afraid of. The choice was his. She left him standing there in the empty parking lot, surrounded by the smell of ocean salt and car exhaust, and Nathaniel felt something crack open inside him that had been sealed for so long he'd forgotten it existed. Fear, not of death, not of failure, Fear of being seen completely and found wanting. Fear that beneath the empire, beneath the name, beneath every achievement and acquisition, he was ordinary, unremarkable, not special enough to deserve the extraordinary. And Elena, with her worn scrubs and tired eyes and absolute refusal to be impressed, she'd looked at him and offered something more terrifying than judgment. She'd offered him the chance to find out. That night, Nathaniel sat down and wrote something he'd never written before. Not a strategy, not an email, not a calculated communication. The truth. Every word felt like removing armor he'd worn so long he'd forgotten it wasn't skin. And when he finished, hands shaking, he realized he had no idea if it would be enough. But for the first time in his life, he was willing to find out. The letter sat sealed on his kitchen table for 2 days before he found the courage to deliver it. Not because he didn't know what he'd written, every word was carved into his memory like scar tissue, but because once Elena read it, there would be no performance left to hide behind, no strategy, no carefully constructed version of himself that could be adjusted based on her reaction. Just the raw, undefended truth of a man who'd spent 34 years confusing success with worth. On the third morning, he walked to the clinic before dawn, before the courage could evaporate, left the envelope with the night receptionist, walked back to the cottage with his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape, and waited. The response came faster than he expected. Not a letter, not a call. Elena appeared at his door that evening, still in her scrubs, hair escaping its braid, exhaustion and something else, something fiercer, burning in her eyes. She held his letter, pages worn from repeated reading, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then she stepped inside without invitation, set the letter on the table between them, and the air in the room shifted into something dense and electric. What followed wasn't forgiveness. Forgiveness would have been easier, cleaner, a transaction he could understand. Instead, Elena spoke with the kind of honesty that felt like surgery. She told him about reading his confession, about his childhood spent being groomed for succession rather than loved, about board meetings at age 12, about learning that vulnerability was weakness and weakness was failure, about watching his father treat his mother like an asset to be managed, about the diagnosis that had felt less like a tragedy and more like permission to finally stop performing. She'd read it all, every ugly, undefended truth, and her response was both simpler and more complex than he'd imagined. Elena didn't care about his money, didn't care about his name or his empire, or the fact that his quarterly earnings could fund her clinic for a decade. What she cared about was the question beneath his confession, the one he'd been too afraid to ask directly. Could someone love the person he was without the armor? Her answer wasn't yes or no. It was a challenge. She couldn't answer that question because she didn't know who he was yet. The man in the cottage was a sketch, incomplete. The man in the business articles was a performance, polished and impenetrable. And somewhere between those versions was an actual human being who'd spent so long hiding that even he didn't know what he looked like. So she offered him something more terrifying than judgment or absolution: time. Not the manufactured deadline of a false diagnosis. Real time. Messy and uncertain and impossible to control. Time to figure out who Nathaniel Cross was when no one was watching. When there was no empire to build, no board to impress, no legacy to uphold. Time to be ordinary. And if that terrified him, if the thought of being unremarkable made him want to run back to the safety of conquest and accumulation, then he should go. Return to the empire, reclaim his throne, live the life he'd been bred for. But if he stayed, it had to be for himself, not for her, not to prove something, not as another strategy in a lifetime of calculated moves, just to stay. She left him with that choice hanging in the air like smoke, dissipating but never quite disappearing. And Nathaniel sat in the silence of the cottage, surrounded by the simple furniture and unwashed dishes, and all the ordinary markers of a life he'd been pretending to live, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. He thought about his grandfather's funeral, the cathedral filled with business associates who spoke eloquently about his vision but couldn't name his favorite book. About his father, still alive but unreachable, a man who'd turned his own heart into a quarterly report. About the empire waiting for him to return, sharp-edged and magnificent and utterly soulless. And he thought about Elena's challenge, the audacity of it, the recognition that beneath his confession was the same pattern he'd always followed, trying to control the outcome, to strategize his way to certainty. She was asking him to do the one thing he'd never done, surrender control. The next morning, he started small, walked to the local market instead of having groceries delivered, learned the cashier's name, Rosa, grandmother of 3, tired smile that became genuine when he asked about her grandson's baseball game, sat at the counter of the diner and ate breakfast among fishermen and construction workers who didn't know or care who he used to be. It felt absurd at first, performative, like he was playing a role in some independent film about self-discovery. But slowly, incrementally, something shifted. The fisherman next to him at the diner, Tom, weathered face and calloused hands, started telling him about the halibut he'd caught that morning. Not because Tom wanted anything, not because he recognized wealth or power or potential advantage, just because sometimes humans told each other stories. And Nathaniel listened, actually listened, not strategizing or calculating or planning his response, just present. Elena watched from a distance, neither encouraging nor discouraging. She'd see him at the market, at the clinic, walking the beach at dawn. And sometimes their eyes would meet, and he'd see something in her expression that wasn't quite approval, but wasn't dismissal either. Recognition, maybe, of the work it took to unmake yourself. Weeks passed, then a month. The board's deadline came and went. His brother was officially announced as CEO. The business press wrote think pieces about Nathaniel Cross's mysterious disappearance. Some speculated burnout, others suggested scandal. A few romanticized it as a spiritual awakening. None of them came close to the truth. The truth was quieter, less dramatic. He was learning how to be ordinary, and it was the hardest thing he'd ever done. Late one evening, his father called, the first time they'd spoken in 8 weeks. Victor Cross didn't ask where Nathaniel was or why he'd abandoned the empire, didn't express concern or anger or disappointment. Instead, he said something Nathaniel had never heard in his father's voice before: envy. Victor spoke about watching his own father die alone, about inheriting an empire at 25 and spending 40 years protecting it, expanding it, sacrificing everything to it, about looking up one day to realize he'd built an empire, but lost a life. And now his son had done what he'd never had the courage to do: walk away. The call ended without resolution, without reconciliation, just a fracture in the pattern, a recognition that perhaps the Cross legacy wasn't destiny, but choice, and some choices couldn't be unmade. That night, Nathaniel found Elena on the beach, barefoot in the sand, watching the moon paint silver across the waves. He didn't speak, didn't need to. Just stood beside her in the ancient human silence that existed before language, before strategy, before fear. And she reached out, slowly, and took his hand. Not as absolution, not as promise, just as presence. Her hand in his felt like an answer to a question he'd forgotten how to ask. They stood there as the tide crawled up the sand, erasing footprints, making the beach new again with each retreat and return. The moon hung low and enormous, turning the ocean into hammered silver, and for once Nathaniel wasn't thinking 3 moves ahead, wasn't calculating outcomes or managing risk. He was just there. Being there, actually being present without agenda or armor, felt like learning a language he'd once known as a child, but had forgotten through decades of strategic conditioning. Elena's thumb traced a slow circle against his palm, unconscious and rhythmic, and he realized she was trembling slightly. Not from cold, from the same terrifying vulnerability that was coursing through him. They were both afraid. and somehow that made it possible. The weeks that followed didn't follow any script Nathaniel recognized. There was no dramatic declaration, no moment where everything crystallized into certainty. Instead, there was accumulation, small moments stacking like stones into something weight-bearing. Eleanor started appearing at the cottage in the evenings after her shifts, too tired to go home, carrying takeout containers and falling asleep on his couch mid-sentence. He'd cover her with a blanket and work quietly at the table, answering emails from Marcus about the transition, helping his brother navigate the board politics not as a rival, but as a guide. Letting go felt like breathing out after holding his breath for years. Some mornings they'd walk the beach in silence, her collecting shells, him learning the names of seabirds he'd never noticed before. Cormorants, sanderlings, plovers, species that had existed in his peripheral vision his entire life, invisible until someone taught him to see. Eleanor had that gift, making the ordinary extraordinary through attention. She'd stop to watch a heron fishing in the shallows, utterly still, and explain how they could stand motionless for hours, waiting. Patience as survival strategy. And Nathaniel would watch her watching the bird and understand he was learning something essential about the difference between waiting and hiding. One evening, she brought him to the community center where she volunteered, teaching basic health literacy to immigrant families. The room was cramped and fluorescent bright, smelling of coffee and industrial cleaner. 20 people crowded around folding tables, ranging from teenagers to grandmothers, taking notes in the margins of photocopied handouts about nutrition and blood pressure, and when to seek emergency care. Elena moved through the material with practiced ease, translating medical jargon into language that connected, that mattered, turning abstract concepts into tools people could use to protect themselves and the people they loved. Nathaniel sat in the back and watched her transform information into power, the quiet, unglamorous power of knowledge, shared rather than hoarded. After the class, an elderly woman approached Eleanor with a question about her husband's medication. The conversation happened in rapid Spanish, Elena's hand on the woman's shoulder, both of them leaning close. When the woman left, her face held relief so profound it bordered on joy. Elena turned to find Nathaniel watching, and something passed between them. Not words, but understanding. This was what mattered, not market share or quarterly earnings or empire expansion, just humans helping humans survive. Late that night, back at the cottage, Eleanor asked him what he missed about his old life. The question landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading. Nathaniel sat with it, refusing the easy answer. After a long silence, he told her the truth. He missed the clarity. In that world, success was measurable, quantifiable. You could point to acquisition totals and stock prices and know exactly where you stood. But here, in this slower, quieter existence, success was invisible, unmeasurable. A grandmother's relief, a stranger learning your name. Eleanor's hand in his as they watched the tide. How did you measure that? How did you know if you were succeeding? Elena listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she offered something that wasn't comfort or solution. She told him about her brother's final week, how he'd been terrified that his life had been wasted, that he hadn't accomplished enough, hadn't left a mark significant enough to justify his existence. And she'd asked him a question that had haunted her ever since. Accomplished for whom? Significant to whom? A mark measured by what standard? Her brother had been a teacher, had spent 20 years in underfunded schools, working with kids everyone else had written off. And in his final days, those former students had filled his hospital room. Doctors, artists, mechanics, mothers, each one carrying some piece of wisdom or encouragement or belief he'd given them. His mark was unmeasurable, but undeniable. That, Elena said quietly, was the difference between legacy and impact. Legacy was what you left behind. Impact was what you gave forward. And Nathaniel could spend his life building monuments to himself, or he could spend it being useful. The choice was still his. Something broke open in him then, not dramatically, but the way ice breaks in spring, slowly, inevitably, making way for something that had been frozen beneath. He thought about the empire, the cross name, the quarterly reports and board presentations and strategic acquisitions that had consumed decades, all of it designed to prove he mattered. But to whom? For what? His grandfather had built an empire and died alone. His father had fortified it and lost himself. And Nathaniel had been racing toward the same ending until a false diagnosis had given him permission to ask the question he'd been too afraid to face. What did he actually want? Not what he'd been trained to want, not what was expected, not what would prove his worth to people who measured worth in market capitalization. What did he, the person beneath the performance, actually want? The answer came not as revelation, but as recognition. He wanted this, these quiet evenings, these conversations that didn't go anywhere but deeper. This woman who refused to be impressed by anything except honesty, this life that couldn't be optimized or strategized or controlled. He wanted to be ordinary, and that wanting felt revolutionary. 2 months after the falsified diagnosis, after the empire had moved on without him, after he'd chosen Elena's challenge over his father's legacy, Nathaniel received a package. Inside, a small wooden box, hand-carved, no note. He recognized his grandfather's craftsmanship immediately. The old man had built furniture in rare private moments, pieces that existed in family homes but were never photographed or displayed publicly. Inside the box, a letter, old paper, careful handwriting. His grandfather's final words, written years before his death, held by the family lawyer with instructions to deliver only if Nathaniel ever walked away from the empire. The letter was brief, just 3 paragraphs, but the final line hit Nathaniel like a fist. "I built all of this hoping you'd be brave enough not to need it." He read it twice, 3 times. Then walked to the beach where Eleanor was waiting, letter trembling in his hands, and understood that maybe legacy and impact weren't opposites after all. Maybe the greatest legacy was giving someone permission to choose differently. That night, wrapped in Elena's arms, Nathaniel Cross finally stopped running. Not because he'd arrived somewhere, but because he'd finally learned the difference between hiding and resting. And rest, he was learning, required trust. The kind of trust that only came from being seen completely, flaws and fears and ordinary humanness, and not being abandoned. Spring arrived without announcement, turning the coastal town into something softer. Nathaniel had been living as Nate Rivers for 4 months now, and the distinction between the 2 identities had blurred into something he couldn't quite name. Not erasure, not transformation. Something closer to integration, the way a river carries sediment from one place and deposits it somewhere else, creating new land. He'd started volunteering at Elena's clinic, doing intake paperwork and insurance navigation, tasks that required no particular skill beyond patience and the willingness to sit with people's frustration at systems designed to exhaust rather than serve. It was humbling work, invisible work, the kind that left no mark, except in the incremental relief on a mother's face when she realized her daughter's medication would be covered after all. Some days he'd catch himself calculating the efficiency improvements he could implement. Better software, streamlined processes, strategic partnerships. The instinct was still there, hardwired after decades, but he was learning to let it pass without acting on it, learning that not everything needed to be optimized. That sometimes inefficiency was just the texture of being human. Elena watched this evolution with careful attention, neither celebrating nor critiquing. She'd told him once that transformation wasn't linear. It was spiral. You'd think you'd moved past something, grown beyond an old pattern, and then you'd find yourself facing it again from a slightly different angle. The work wasn't to avoid the spiral, but to notice when you were in it. And Nathaniel was learning to notice. The moments when his jaw would tighten at perceived inefficiency, when he'd mentally calculate the net worth of donors at the clinic's fundraiser, when he'd catch himself performing humility rather than living it. Elena had a way of looking at him in those moments, not judgment but recognition, seeing him clearly without trying to fix him. That seeing was its own form of love, he was discovering. Not the romantic ideal he'd encountered in movies or novels, but something grittier and more sustaining. The love that stayed when the performance dropped, when the mask cracked, when ordinary human messiness surfaced and couldn't be strategized away. His father called occasionally now, conversations that felt like two people learning a foreign language together. Victor Cross had stepped back from the company entirely, handed full control to Nathaniel's brother, and moved to the family's lake house, a property that had existed in trust for 3 generations, but that no one had actually lived in for more than a weekend. The elder Cross spent his days woodworking, picking up the craft his own father had practiced in secret. And slowly, across stilted phone conversations, Nathaniel began to understand what his grandfather's final letter had meant. Each generation of Crossmen had been given an empire and lost themselves, and each had hoped their son would be brave enough to choose differently. His grandfather had written that letter, knowing he couldn't make the choice himself. He was too embedded, too defined by what he'd built. But he could create the conditions for Nathaniel to choose. The falsified diagnosis had been Marcus's idea, but the money that made it possible, the elaborate staging, the careful construction of an escape route, all of it traced back to funds his grandfather had set aside in a separate trust. Money specifically designated for if his heir ever wanted to disappear. An empire built to give someone permission to leave it. The revelation had arrived in a second letter from the family lawyer, and Nathaniel had sat with it for days, trying to process the complicated love beneath the manipulation. His grandfather had been a hard man, distant, more comfortable with ledgers than affection. But he'd spent his final years building an exit for the grandson he barely knew how to talk to. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. Marcus visited again in late spring, no longer as assistant, but as something closer to friend. They sat on the cottage porch, drinking coffee, while sunrise painted the ocean in shades of copper and rose. Marcus had stayed with the company through the transition, helping Nathaniel's brother navigate the politics, but he was leaving now, starting his own consultancy, using everything he'd learned serving empires to help smaller companies survive without losing themselves. The conversation meandered through logistics and memories, and eventually settled on the question Marcus had clearly come to ask. Was Nathaniel happy? The question sat between them like a stone, heavy with implication. Nathaniel watched a fishing boat cut across the harbor, nets hanging like dark lace against the brightening sky, thought about happiness, how he'd once measured it in achievements and acquisitions, in the dopamine rush of closed deals and exceeded projections. That version of happiness had been real but unsustainable, like running on adrenaline, always needing the next hit, the next win, the next proof of worth. This version was quieter, less dramatic. Some days it felt like contentment, other days like grief for the person he'd been and could never quite go back to being. But beneath both was something steadier, something that didn't require external validation to exist. Not happiness exactly, maybe peace. The kind of peace that only came from stopping the war with yourself. Marcus left with an embrace that felt like release, both of them letting go of the roles they'd played, the power dynamics that had defined them, the whole elaborate architecture of who they'd needed to be for each other. And Nathaniel stood on the porch alone, watching the boat disappear into morning light, and felt the weight of choice settle around him like gravity. He could go back. The path was still there. His brother would step aside in a heartbeat. The board would celebrate his return. The empire would welcome its prodigal heir with strategic enthusiasm. Or he could stay. Keep building this smaller, quieter life that left no mark on quarterly reports, but changed him in ways he was still discovering. That evening, Eleanor found him at the tide pools, crouched among the rocks, watching hermit crabs navigate their borrowed shells. She sat beside him in comfortable silence, and they watched together as the creatures moved between shells, trying different ones, abandoning what no longer fit, the constant work of finding protection that didn't become prison. After a long while, Elena spoke, voice barely audible above the surf. She'd been offered a position at a hospital in the city, better pay, better resources, the chance to impact more people, everything she'd worked toward. But taking it meant leaving this place. This life. Him. The parallel was so obvious it didn't need naming. Two people, both facing the choice between what they'd been moving toward and what they'd discovered along the way. Both terrified that choosing one meant betraying some essential part of themselves. Nathaniel's chest tightened, but before fear could consume him, something shifted. He took her hand, cold from the evening air, and understood that this was the test he'd been moving toward all along. Not whether he could walk away from Empire, but whether he could let go of control entirely. Let someone else make their choice without trying to manage the outcome, without strategy or manipulation or the careful architecture of influence. Just trust. The tide was coming in, water filling the pools around them, and Nathaniel Cross, or Nate Rivers, or whoever he was becoming, spoke the hardest truth he'd ever offered. He told her to take the job, not as sacrifice, not as strategy, but because he finally understood that love wasn't holding on. It was creating space for someone to become fully themselves, even if that meant becoming something that didn't include you. Elena didn't answer immediately. She sat with his words the way she sat with everything. Patient, deliberate, refusing to rush towards certainty. The ocean filled the spaces between heartbeats, constant and indifferent, and Nathaniel felt the enormity of what he'd just offered settle into his bones. He'd spent his entire life trying to control outcomes, and now he was learning that the deepest form of love was releasing that control entirely. Finally, Eleanor turned to face him, and in the fading light her eyes held something that looked like recognition. Not gratitude, not relief. Something deeper, the acknowledgement that he'd finally understood the lesson she'd been teaching since the day she found that newspaper on his floor. Love required honesty, and honesty required courage. And courage meant being willing to lose everything you were afraid to live without. She leaned forward, pressed her forehead against his, and in that moment of shared breath and silence, something fundamental shifted between them. 3 weeks later, Elena accepted the hospital position. The town threw her a farewell gathering at the community center, the space packed with patients and volunteers and families whose lives she'd touched in ways both measurable and invisible. An elderly man stood and spoke haltingly about how she'd taught him to manage his diabetes. A young mother cried while explaining how Elena had stayed with her through a miscarriage when the hospital had sent her home too early. Nathaniel watched from the side, understanding with piercing clarity what impact actually looked like. Not monuments, not legacy carved in marble or measured in market share, just humans remembering the person who'd seen them when they felt invisible. Elena gave a brief speech, voice steady but eyes bright with unshed tears, thanking the community for teaching her that medicine wasn't about systems or protocols, but about presence, about showing up, about staying when staying was the hardest thing to do. Her gaze found Nathaniel's across the crowded room, and in that look was everything neither of them had learned how to say yet. The night before she left, they returned to the beach where this had all begun. The same stretch of sand where she'd confronted him with the newspaper, where she'd challenged him to choose truth over performance, where he'd first taken her hand and learned that vulnerability was strength disguised as surrender. They walked in silence, and Nathaniel felt time collapsing, past and present and uncertain future all existing simultaneously in the sound of waves and the salt-thick air and the warmth of her hand in his. Eventually they stopped, and Elena spoke with the careful precision of someone who'd rehearsed these words 1,000 times, but still wasn't certain they were right. She told him about the choice she'd been wrestling with, not between him and the job, but between safety and growth. She'd built a good life here, manageable and known. The hospital represented risk, uncertainty, the possibility of failure on a larger stage, but staying felt like hiding, like choosing comfort over courage. And watching him face his own fears, watching him dismantle the armor he'd worn for decades, brick by painful brick, had shown her that growth required the willingness to be uncomfortable, to choose the uncertain path, not because you knew where it led, but because staying still meant slowly calcifying into someone you didn't recognize. She was afraid, terrified actually, but she was going anyway. And she needed him to know that his gift to her, telling her to go, releasing control, trusting her to make her own choice, was the most profound act of love she'd ever received. Nathaniel's throat tightened, years of practiced composure crumbling in the face of her honesty. He'd thought letting her go was the ending, the noble sacrifice, the proof that he'd finally learned to love without possession. But Eleanor was offering him something he hadn't considered: continuation, not certainty, not promises, just the willingness to keep choosing each other across distance and change, and the terrifying uncertainty of two people becoming whoever they were meant to be. She was leaving, but she wasn't disappearing. The distinction felt revolutionary. They stood there as night deepened around them, stars emerging in the gaps between clouds, and Nathaniel understood that this was the moment his whole life had been preparing him for. Not the grand achievements, not the empire or the legacy or the quarterly earnings that had once defined success. Just this, standing on a beach with someone who saw him completely, past and present, armor and wound, the person he'd been and the person he was still becoming, and choosing to stay connected even when geography pulled them apart. He pulled her close and she melted into him with a sigh that held months of accumulated tension. They stood like that for a long time, two people learning that intimacy wasn't about proximity, but about honesty, about being willing to be seen in your full, flawed humanity and trusting that the seeing wouldn't become abandonment. 6 months passed like breath. Nathaniel stood in a small office in the city, walls painted the color of eggshells, afternoon light streaming through windows that overlooked a neighborhood most developers had written off as unprofitable. The space housed his new venture, part consulting firm, part non-profit, entirely his own vision. He helped small businesses in underserved communities navigate growth without losing their soul, taught entrepreneurs the financial literacy and strategic thinking he'd spent decades mastering, but oriented towards sustainability rather than extraction. It was unglamorous work, low profile, the kind that would never make business headlines or generate the adrenaline rush of billion-dollar acquisitions. But it mattered. Elena's hospital was 20 minutes away, and some evenings she'd meet him after her shift, both of them exhausted, but filled with the particular satisfaction that came from work that aligned with values. They'd walk through the city streets hand in hand, talking about their days, her patients, his clients, the thousand small complications of trying to do good work in systems not designed to support it. And sometimes they'd stop in a park or on a corner, and Eleanor would look at him with those dark eyes that still saw everything, and ask the question that had become their shared ritual. Who are you today? Not who were you? Not who will you be? Who are you right now in this moment, with no performance and no projection? And Nathaniel would answer honestly, some days confident, other days uncertain, always in process, still becoming. Late one evening, his father called. Victor Cross had something to say, voice rough with the effort of words that didn't come naturally. He'd been thinking about his own father's letter, about the pattern of cross men building empires and losing themselves. And he wanted Nathaniel to know something. He was proud. Not of the empire Nathaniel had walked away from, not of the achievements or accolades or the strategic brilliance that had once defined the heir, but of the courage it took to stop, to choose uncertainty over prestige, to risk being ordinary in service of being real. That, Victor said quietly, was the bravest thing any Cross had ever done. The call ended with an invitation. Would Nathaniel join him at the lake house sometime? Not for business, not for strategy, just to sit, maybe build something with their hands, learn who they might be to each other without the empire between them. Nathaniel said yes. That night, in the apartment he and Elena now shared, Nathaniel stood by the window and watched the city breathe, lights flickering on and off in 10,000 windows, each one containing a life he'd never know, struggles and joys invisible from this distance. He thought about the man he'd been, the billionaire heir convinced that control equaled safety, that achievement equaled worth, that vulnerability equaled weakness, and he thought about who he was becoming. Still flawed, still learning, still afraid sometimes, but no longer hiding. Elena came up behind him, wrapped her arms around his waist, and they stood together in comfortable silence. After a while she spoke, voice soft against his shoulder. She'd been thinking about his grandfather's letter, about empires built to give someone permission to leave, and she wondered if maybe that was what love always was, building something strong enough that the people you loved could choose to walk away and know they'd survive, creating foundation rather than prison, offering roots but never chains. Nathaniel turned to face her, and in her eyes he saw his own transformation reflected back, messy and incomplete and ongoing. He kissed her forehead, gentle and sure, and understood that this was what he'd been searching for all along. Not certainty, not control, not proof of worth measured in metrics and monuments. Just this, the courage to be seen completely and the grace to see someone else the same way. Years later, when people asked Nathaniel Cross about his life, about the empire he'd walked away from and the quiet work he'd chosen instead, he'd smile and offer a truth that sounded simple, but had cost him everything to learn. He'd tell them about a false diagnosis that gave him permission to ask real questions, about a woman who'd refused to be impressed by anything except honesty, about learning that the opposite of control wasn't chaos, but trust. And he'd tell them that he'd spent 34 years building armor to protect himself from being ordinary, only to discover that ordinary, truly deeply ordinary, was the most extraordinary thing he'd ever been brave enough to become. Rate this story from 0 to 10 in the comments below. And if you believe that real courage is choosing to be fully human, subscribe and let me know what moved you most.